What's up, gamers? Mr. Henderson back with another Minecraft tutorial video. LLJK, this is just notes. So I'll be gone obviously today and then in 8th period and then tomorrow. So these notes should help take you guys through the understanding of classification so that whenever I get back on Friday, we'll be able to go through a dichotomous key. So we're going to go through the notes. As you're following along, feel free to pause the video. That way if you need to write anything down and then you can listen, that would be great. And then I'll kind of talk you guys through each slide and go through the information. And then you might have some questions to be answering as you're going through this as well. So make sure you have the fill-in-the-blank notes, which I've also included in the Google Classroom link here. And then you can be just following along as we go. So we left off talking about the different genuses and how we kind of name things. And there is a governing body that actually tells us how we can name things and who gets to name what. And so the reason we have that is so that we can actually have organization to this process. Also, they help us prevent having duplicated names because we wouldn't want to use the same name for two different organisms. So the International Naming Congress or the International Zoological Congress is the governing body that you would have to submit a name to if you discovered a new species. And so they'll review your submission and then they'll say, yes, you can use that name, or no, that name's already used, or it doesn't really make sense. They might offer you some kind of suggestion. So you can kind of name things based on whatever you want, but it has to follow certain rules as approved by the International Code for Binomial Nomenclature. And remember that binomial nomenclature just means two names. Getting into some classification groups, when we refer to these, we refer to them in general as a taxon. And so when we refer to the taxonomy of an organism, we're just really talking about like how it's organized into these taxa, which is the plural version of taxon. So one example of this is the hierarchy of groups, kind of creating this system where we can look at exactly where something fits in. And the order that we use for that, I'm going to move my camera up, is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And you'll see that genus and species down here is italicized like we did before. And so remember that we're going to capitalize the genus name, and then the species name is going to be underlined if we're writing it, or italicized if you're typing it. But the genus name and everything else would be capitalized. So for example, with like humans, we are Homo sapien. So I'm capitalizing the H, and I know it looks like I drew a capital S here, but that's a lowercase s. And then the family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain, we could go all the way up with humans, which we'll be doing here in a little bit. So domain obviously would be the biggest group. And you can see how with this hierarchy, kind of the system where you think about like the hierarchy or like your monarchy, you have your king, and then like the queen, the prince, princess, nobles, other people in the kingdom. So then the next one is the phylum, which is the division. Like for example, if we're thinking about like plants, a lot of times you're looking at the phylum level when they're dividing them. Class, order, family, genus, and species. Species being the most specific. Domain, of course, being the broadest. So if you tell me the exact species of an organism, then I know exactly what you're talking about. If you tell me that they're in the domain Eukarya, all I know is they're a eukaryote. It doesn't really tell me very much. But if we go through this system, we can figure out exactly what the organism might be. One example of this would be with bears. Let's say that we're looking at something like this Ursus arctos, which is a grizzly bear. You can see here that it's part of the kingdom Animalia. And then it's the phylum Chordata, which means it has a backbone. Mammalia, because it has fur, it produces milk. Carnivora, of course, it's a meat eater, really omnivore. Ursidae, which is the family of bears. Then we have Ursus, which is a particular type of bear, thinking about like North American bears versus the panda bear here. And then you have finally the species Ursus arctos, which is exactly one bear, the American grizzly bear. So you can see as we go from kingdom all the way down to species how we get more and more and more specific. There is an acronym to help you remember these because you are going to have to know. Domain would obviously be eukarya here, and then the next one would be kingdom. So we have this acronym to remember: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and it's Dear King Philip came over from glorious Spain. So that's just one. If you want to prefer or make a different one, you're welcome to do so. As long as it helps you remember, then that is great. There's a table here which actually shows us something kind of interesting, and that's the classification of humans. So you can see we're part of the domain Eukarya. Of course, ourselves have nuclei. Animalia, because although we don't like to think it, we are animals. Chordata, meaning we have a spine and a backbone, or at least most of us do. Mammalia, because we have hair, we produce milk through mammary glands. We give live birth as well. Primates, we're adapted to climb trees. Hominid means we're able to walk upright. And then the family Hominidae means walking erect. So specifically, if you think about back in the day, like Homo erectus or Homo neanderthalis, they're all part of the family Hominidae. And then the genus Homo means large brain and tool use, and then species sapien, of course, means that we have body proportions of modern humans. Currently, most genuses have lots of different organisms, but humans are unique in the fact that the genus Homo only has one living species, and that is Homo sapien. So a little bit more about the other domains. Of course, these are the broadest, as we said, most inclusive taxon. And there's three that we will kind of go through in this class. The first one is archaea, or bacteria. These are unicellular prokaryotes, which means they have no nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles. Then we would have the eukarya, which are the more complex ones that have a nucleus with membrane-bound organelles. The archaea bacteria is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting ones because they are the extremophile bacteria. When we say extremophile, what we mean by that, it's not spelled right, extremophile, they are adapted to extreme environments. For example, we'll look at one in a moment here, which is a methanogen, meaning it's adapted to high methane environments. So like a sewage treatment plant or like a stinky classroom where a bunch of people have farted, a methanogen is going to thrive there. Thermophile means they're able to adapt into extreme heat or extreme cold. For example, like ones that live around volcanic vents or in hot springs. You also have some that are acidophiles. They can live in really acidic environments or really basic environments, like Starbucks Frappuccino, for example. Just kidding. And then you also have some that are halophiles, where you can get into really, really salty water. Or, for example, like in the Dead Sea. Here's an image of one of our archaean brethren. So this is the methanogen. You can see here that it's got kind of weird structure. We don't have any kind of nuclei visible on the image here, but really a weird deal, kind of alien looking. And by the way, this would of course be a scanning electron micrograph, so this is not a living specimen. Then we jump into bacteria, the kingdom Eubacteria. A lot of these are going to be your disease-causing bacteria. So when you think about like something getting food poisoning or something like that, that's the kind of organism we're talking about here. These are typically found pretty much anywhere, including even in your own body. Some of them are really important for decomposing different organisms, and then others are important even for humans in terms of like digestion. If you think about cottage cheese and yogurt and buttermilk, you have to have a healthy internal anatomy and internal bacteria in order to be able to digest things properly. So these are really important, and you're actually made up of a pretty good chunk of bacteria. This is a sample of E. coli, which is not always a bad thing. It's actually living inside the intestines of most animals, and it helps with digestion, but some strains of it can cause things like food poisoning or extreme diarrhea, really some not so fun stuff. So this is what those would look like. You can see almost like little pill-shaped organisms. And then the domain Eukarya, which is the other kind of big branch of the tree of life, would be divided into three kingdoms as we know them. One is Protista. This is your protozoans, so like when we looked at the pond water, if you remember that, all those little critters. Algae is included in this group. Then we have the fungi, which would be like your mushrooms, your yeasts. Also then the big ones that you know about, which is Plantae. Of course, this is like multicellular plants, trees, ferns, flowers, etc. And then animals, or Animalia. Alright, so we're going to go through each of these pretty quickly here. The first one being Protista. Protista is going to be mostly unicellular, but some are going to be multicellular. So looking at the organisms over here, we can see some things which are made of multiple cells, whereas other things are one cell in and of themselves. Some of them are autotrophic, and some of them are heterotrophic. If you don't remember these words, think about your prefixes here. Auto means self, whereas hetero means other. And so if I'm autotrophic, I can basically feed myself. I make my own energy. You can see some of these are green in coloration, suggesting they can probably do photosynthesis. If I'm heterotrophic, maybe I'm like this guy where I actually have to go and eat different organisms. So I eat something that's not me, in other words, an other feeder. Many of them are aquatic. You can see a lot of these are on light microscope slides where they've been prepared with just water. Fungi is our next big group. You can see some examples here of some mushrooms, probably not ones you would want to eat. Most of these are poisonous. A lot of the fungi are going to be multicellular. The only exception to this is yeast, of course, which is single-celled. Most of these are absorbative heterotrophs. What we mean by that is they eat something else, but they don't really eat it. They're more just kind of breaking it down and digesting it, and then absorbing it into their body. Really important for you to remember this and understand that their walls are made of chitin. Instead of having cellulose as their primary structural component, chitin is this kind of rough and rigid material which allows them to stand up like plants, but they're not plants, they're fungi. They're completely different. No photosynthesis here. The next group is plants. Here's an example of a plant if you've not seen one. Here's also an example of one. So the question of how do we get from the little one to the big one obviously is cells. We have to grow many more cells. So these are multicellular, autotrophic, and of course, as we know, they absorb sunlight to make glucose through the process of photosynthesis. Their cell walls are made of cellulose. So remember, fungi, chitin. Plantae, cellulose, so kind of those boxy type cells that we see. And then animalia, as we're familiar with, here's an example of an animal. Multicellular. Ingestive heterotrophs, meaning they actually consume the food. They eat food from outside the environment and then put it into their bodies. Sometimes they have help if they have a mama bird that's feeding them. And then they're going to feed on plants or animals. So you have a handy chart here. You have different examples of organisms. We see their kingdom in the top here, Protista, fungi, plantae, animalia. And this is some comparative organisms. So we see some examples of fungi, plants, animals, and then protists up here at the top. The thing about protists is if you're not sure what something is, like you see something like this and you're like, I don't know what the heck that is, it's probably a protist if it's unicellular. All right, a little more on taxa. Most of the genera contain lots of similar species. But as we said earlier, the genus Homo is unique in the fact that it only contains us as modern humans. The classification and the way we arrange these taxa is based on evolutionary relationships. So we're going to kind of go back through evolution just for a moment to review. You guys already know this stuff, so it shouldn't take very long. Here's just showing the kingdom Animalia and what makes up that kingdom, mostly insects. And then we have vascular plants over here in the kingdom Plantae. The kingdom Mycota, which is fungi, is right here, showing a lot of those. Protistas, pretty large as well. Animals, definitely making up the majority of this pie chart here. All right, so a little bit of evidence for taxonomy. One of those comes from homologous structures. This is something we should remember from the last unit, where we have the same structure, different function. Another piece of evidence is embryological development. We looked at this once for a HOTS question, but we have an image to talk through. And then lastly, molecular similarity, for example, looking at DNA, RNA, or the amino acid sequence. So here we have an image showing homologous structures. Of course, the different bones are showing different colors. We see like all of these green bones showing the humerus, which is very similar in a bat, a whale, a cheetah, and a human. Clearly, this human is not going to be as fast as the cheetah. And so because of that, the bone structure is slightly different. You can see differences in the size and the positioning of some of the bones. You can also see it with the placement of certain parts of the bones, modifications of certain parts of the bones. For example, the fingers of the whale being very long so that they can push lots of water. But these all suggest that we come from a common ancestor. And so when we're creating our classification system, we're going to put these organisms in a similar part of the tree. Same thing here with embryology. This is showing you the development of a catfish, a human, a pig, a chicken, and then a turtle. And if you go back to very, very early on after fertilization, which is the top picture, not an olive, you see that most things look almost identical. And so this suggests that life on Earth is related and that there are some similarities between the development of all these organisms. So when we put this all together, we're able to create a cladogram. And this is what you're going to be working with tomorrow with the sub. A cladogram is a diagram that shows how organisms are related based on something called derived characteristics. That's another word for saying shared characteristics. For example, if I have an organism that has hair and one that lays eggs, for example, turtles lay eggs, four-legged locomotion, so like the salamander, turtle, and wolf, they all share that characteristic, so I can put it here on my cladogram since everything after it contains that ability. Now the wolf, of course, you might be thinking to yourself, does not contain an amniotic egg. That's because the egg is inside the wolf. As we know, mammals give live birth. So we could even add an extra trait up here if we wanted to and put like live birth instead of laying eggs like turtles do externally. You see that vertebral column is way down here, so all these organisms share a vertebral column, but a lancet does not have any of these characteristics. This is something called the outgroup. The outgroup is where we don't have any of the characteristics on the cladogram, similar to the scissors that you were using in the example that we had you do yesterday. And so because of that, it kind of sets the stage and tells us where we are on the tree. Otherwise, who knows what could be down here, some fungus, a protist. We have to have something to kind of tell us where we're at. Another example of it is here with the primate cladogram. So we see differences between these different organisms. This does not show that humans are turning into monkeys. This is showing that if you go back far enough, that there are certain traits that we see in an ancestor that would be common to all these different branches on the primate evolution cladogram. Dichotomous keys we're going to talk more about on Friday whenever I come back, and we're going to do a fun lab with it. But basically it's a thing that's similar to the cladogram, allows you to compare and identify different organisms. Something you do on it is you basically take and read both characteristics that are given, and it's kind of like a choose your own adventure book. You either choose to go to another set of characteristics, or you're at the end of the dichotomous key and you know which organism you're dealing with. So the way this works then is if we look at this example, this would show us, like if we're looking at this creature here, first question is, does it have tentacles? Tentacles present or tentacles absent? Looking at this guy, he's definitely got some tentacles, so I'm going to go to number 2. Does he have 8 tentacles or more than 8 tentacles? If I count, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it doesn't have 8 or more than 8. But if I count again, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I wonder if this is maybe a tentacle. 8 tells me this is an octopus. And of course I know that's an octopus, but sometimes you have to be careful. For example, let's say that I was looking at this guy down here. I see that there are tentacles present, so I'm going to 2. Definitely more than 8 tentacles in this image, so I'm going to 3. Do the tentacles hang down or are they upright? They're kind of sticking up off of him, almost like hair, and so that tells me that this is a sea anemone. Otherwise, I would have gone to 4 and seen that it's a jellyfish because it has a balloon-shaped body. So that's classification in a nutshell. After you finish your notes, which hopefully you can go back and record anything you need to and answer all these questions, then you'll be doing some practice activities with cladograms. And if you have any questions, hopefully we can clarify them on Friday.